Inspired initiative and on the progress you're making. I think that's why I'm here. Pastor John and I have known each other since his seminary days and have retained our friendship over these years. The text that I'd like to share with you, and it's a very brief text and one you can probably memorize. It's up there, John 1:16. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. I'd like that to pass your lips 3 times. So we're actually going to say it together 3 times. Ready? For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Second time. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. And once more with feeling. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Years ago, when I served a church out in Oregon, there it is again. When I served a church out in Oregon, we were blessed to host a refugee family from Cambodia. And they had survived the war that had crept into Cambodia in the late 60s and early 70s, and had spent time in a refugee camp. And some of you are aware of the Khmer Rouge that was coming in at that time and causing nightmares, horrific persecution. But we brought them over through Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, and I was blessed to be with them the first time they ever walked through one of our grocery stores, our supermarkets. And I'll never forget the mom of this family. I recall they had 4 children. They had mom, dad, and the 4 kids, and they walked up and down those lines of grocery shelves, and finally the mom's eyes began to fill up with tears. And I said, "You're crying. Why are you crying?" And in her attempt to speak English, it came through. There is so much. There's just too much. There was so much food in that grocery store that she did not know where to begin. It took us about 10 minutes before we finally put something down into that shopping cart. And it dawned on me how it's true for so many of us that we can be surrounded by so much blessing and so much grace that we can take it for granted. I think that happens to a lot of us these days. You can think about people in the Ukraine these days and tell me that they're taking for granted the political freedoms that they have. They're not, because they're at risk these days, and they value those freedoms. God's grace is like that. It's extravagant. That is, it just keeps coming. It doesn't stop. It starts for Lakota with his baptism, but it's going to be there again and again in his life, once and again, and another time, like sheep going over a fence, one, then another. So it's baptism, but it's the Lord's Supper. It's when I'm hurting and I open the scriptures and God speaks a word to me. It's when a friend shares the gospel with me. It's when I'm sick and a pastor visits or an elder visits, a friend visits. More grace, still coming at me. That's what it's like to be a Christian. God's never-ending, rolling, extravagant grace. Grace upon grace, John calls it. God doing one thing after another. And if you've got any Lutheran fiber cooking in you at all, you love that grace, because that's at the center of our theology. We start with grace as Lutheran Christians. So Presbyterians have their sovereignty of God. Baptists have their water. Episcopalians have all that money. But we focus on grace. And they focus on grace with us if they've got anything going as Christians. Our contribution to the symphony of God's Word that's gone on for centuries is to bring people back again and again to the extravagant grace of God. You open your Bible and you look for grace. You come up for communion, you look for grace. You listen to a piece by the choir, and you're listening for grace. We are what we receive. That's the truth. You are what you've received. The scientists can debate whether it's nature or nurture, but there's no question in my mind. Whether it's nature or nurture, it comes to us from God. From God's grace. It's all received. It's that simple. It's like you're a dead man, a dead woman walking, and God's grace infuses you, and you come to life again and again. Apart from Christ, we can do nothing. Back in the 1980s, there was a film that was titled Babette's Feast. Did anybody see that? It had subtitles. It's a Scandinavian film. But it's one of the best films you ever want to see if you want a lesson in grace. And very briefly, Babette is someone who was trained in Paris as a chef, and she makes sacrifice upon sacrifice to create this wonderful feast for family and friends, some of whom haven't seen each other for years and have harbored grudges for years. But as she serves one course of that feast after another, as that extravagant meal is served to these family and friends who had so many reasons not to like each other, you watch them soften toward each other. You watch grace have its way with them, and their gray, drab lives take on wonderful color and depth in relationship. They become, in that film, what they receive. If you look at this text, there's no question, as John tells it, that the grace we have is received from the fullness of Christ. The fullness of Christ. For from his fullness we have all received. That means that Jesus probably has more grace to give you than you can even take in. There's more grace available for you in Jesus Christ than you could ever truly receive. There's so much there. We can only take in so much of his fullness. It's like sucking on the proverbial fire hose. We'll never get it all in. The fullness of Christ marks him as God, and God is God, and you're not. And to know that God is still God in all of his fullness and all of his greatness, and that all of that dwells in Jesus Christ, is what makes us who we are as we tap into that grace of God. You know, before John wrote these words, Paul wrote a letter to Ephesus, which just happens to have been the place where John was the leader of the church. And as Paul wrote the Ephesian Christians, he talks about how the leaders of the church were really given to the church so that the church might attain, look at verse 13, attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. There it is again, that wonderful word, fullness. So when we talk about receiving grace upon grace, we're talking about the truth that we are nothing apart from God, that we are only what we have received from God's extravagant grace. But secondly, we also receive from a source, that source being Jesus Christ, that has more to offer us than we can take in. It's sort of like when a football team, the Green Bay Packers, for instance, it's so hard for me to say, wins one game and then another, and then wins another game, and then wins another game, and you're going 7 or 8 in a row, and tell me that's not exciting. Tell me you're not overwhelmed. Tell me you can't wait till next Sunday or Monday when that game's going to be played. That's what this is like. There's more grace here than you'll ever be able to take in. And I don't know what it's like with you, but sometimes I treat God like he's a very small God. I fit God into my nice little box and just expect him to perform just the way I need God to perform. Not too pushy, not taking too much out of me, but just kind of stay God the way I want you to be. With God's grace, there's always more. When the prodigal son comes home, his dad doesn't just give him a hug. He kills the fatted calf, and there's a robe on his finger. Or there's a robe on him and a ring on his finger, and they lead him in for the party. There's one thing, and then another, and then another. Read the book of Isaiah. When Isaiah presents the gospel, it's one gospel, but there's this too, and there's another thing he wants to share with you, and there's another one. It's like a slideshow. One thing after another. So it's apple pie, but it's also apple pie with a little ice cream. And while we're doing the ice cream, add a few nuts, maybe a little brown sugar, and a little maple syrup. You see, it's more, and it's more, and it's more. That's the way it is with God's grace. Now comes the disappointing news. We can take the grace of God for granted. We can cheapen God's extravagant grace by living lives simply unworthy of all that grace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called that a cheap grace. So, like the grocery store with all its shelves of food. The church can look at the riches placed before us, baptism, the Lord's Supper, a chance to hear the Word every weekend, and take all of that for granted. Maybe show up once in a while rather than every Lord's Day. Grace upon grace. No big deal. Christians seem to be in retreat these days, circling the wagons, turning inward. People look at us from the outside, and they don't see us doing very much that's extravagant. We're not very impressive, you should know, especially to millennials, young adults born between 1982 and 2005. They're not too impressed with us. They don't see us doing extravagant things. Oh, we talk a whole lot about sacrifice and love and generosity. But when they look in, they say there's a gap between what you say you're going to do in church and the way that you live your life outside. And then the church also sets safe little goals. Many churches that I know set goals where, frankly, they don't really need God to accomplish those goals, because they're really easy enough to accomplish just from human standards. So the goals that we set don't require a great and big God. And churches spend so much time arguing over little things. Walt Whitman has a line in one of his poems about being smothered in minutiae. We major in minors. I visit churches as a district president that are in conflict over what color we should paint the fellowship hall. Really? That's why Christ has showered us with his grace so that we can meet and argue over the color of the paint in the fellowship hall. We major in little things rather than majoring in the big things, because God is a big God and has his extravagant grace at work in our life together. How institutional that sounds. As if when Jesus died on the cross for you and for me, he was interested in starting an institution. I don't think so. He was interested in saving the world. He was interested in saving you and me, and he did. And if you place your faith in him, you have eternity waiting for you by grace, through faith in Jesus Christ. That's yours because of what Christ has done to you. It was an extravagant act for the Son of God to allow himself to be pinned to that cross for you and for the whole world. What would happen if the church took seriously the extravagant grace of God? Pastors, we'd probably preach sermons that are better than they deserve. Lay people, we'd be out there talking with our friends and neighbors about the difference Christ is. I know you've got to earn that right. You don't knock on doors anymore and somebody comes up, a stranger, and you say, if you were to die tomorrow, would you sure you go to heaven? We don't do that these days anymore. I did that when I broke into the ministry. That was hard to do. I used to pray. I used to circle the houses I was going to visit, praying, dear Lord, please make it that they're not home, because I don't want to do this. And you know that feeling, how hard it is. And yet if the extravagant grace of God is working in us, that grace of God that sent Jesus Christ to the cross, we're going to want to talk about that, especially with the people we've gotten close to, the the people with whom we've earned the right to share that saving gospel with. You know, when Pastor John called me and invited me to come, I said yes, and I surprised myself by saying yes, but he had prefaced the invitation by telling me what you were doing, this inspired initiative that you've got going. And it was so refreshing to come in contact with a church that was going to do something that was bigger than you can do on your own. There is no way you're going to accomplish this on your own. You need God to do this. You need God to move in each of your hearts and in each of your lives with his extravagant grace to move you to a generosity point where you yourself are being extravagant in your giving. That's asking a lot. You can't do that on your own. That calls for God, this great God of ours, to move extravagantly in your heart with his love and for you to respond with grace and generosity with your gifts. You know, it reminds me of a Garrison Keillor story. We've always got to mention Garrison Keillor. He's a patron saint of Minnesota. And he tells this wonderful story of a farmer who was had been out spreading manure